bloated rats, noxious chemicals, industrial wastes, oil slicks, and fires. These are just a few of the things you would have seen on Cleveland's highly polluted Cuyahoga River in the middle of the 20th century. Clevelanders joked morbidly that if one fell into the river, they did not drown, they decayed. Workers along the river were expected to visit the hospital immediately if they had the extreme misfortune of falling into this toxic miasma. Other descriptions claimed the river did not flow, but oozed, that it bubbled and boiled, rank with the stench of decades of industrial waste. In one report, the US government itself went so far as to say that, quote, the lower Cuyahoga has no visible signs of life, not even low forms such as leeches and sludge worms that usually thrive on wastes, end quote. Such is the state of the Cuyahoga River when, in 1969, it catches on fire. At the time, Clevelanders thought nothing of it. After all, this wasn't the first time the Cuyahoga had become engulfed in flame. In fact, by some estimates, this had happened at least a dozen times before. And by the standards of those previous fires, the blaze of 1969 was small in comparison. It was extinguished in less than 30 minutes and caused only $50,000 in damage. Plus, the Cuyahoga was not the only industrial river to be set ablaze in America at this time. Rivers had also burned in Baltimore, Detroit, Buffalo, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. In our nation's capital, over 240 million gallons of waste were dumped into the Potomac River each day. In Omaha, meat packers dumped grease balls the size of oranges into the Missouri. And so, given the treatment of America's rivers at the time, the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire was a normal occurrence, an everyday affair. Again, Clevelanders thought nothing of it. But there was something different about this 1969 fire. It happened to coincide with a wave of environmental consciousness never before seen in America. People were starting to be fed up with polluted rivers and toxic lakes, with air that was unsafe to breathe, with chemicals falling from the sky, with soil that was too contaminated to grow anything in. They wanted to live in an environment that was safe for themselves and for their children and for their children's children. And the image of a river catching on fire was the perfect symbol for all of America's industrial excesses. The 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, then, is largely credited with galvanizing a nation and kickstarting an era of sweeping environmental reform. But up to this point, environmental action in America was characterized by top-down, large-scale conservation projects. This sort of set-it-and-forget-it mentality whereby we set aside large chunks of public lands, either as national parks or national forests or wildlife refuges, to be protected from future development, from future industrialization and pollution. Well, in post-World War II America, we sort of add this new tool in our toolkit for protecting the environment. We are still doing large-scale set-aside conservation work, but we also start doing this new thing where we clean up and restore past pollution. We restore degraded environments, make our rivers and streams safe for drinking and recreating, and make our air clean to breathe. This era of environmentalism in America is characterized by direct action, of people taking an active role in restoring and reclaiming polluted, degraded environments like the Cuyahoga River. Today, I want to share with you the story of that river, and how the national park that was built around it embodied a new form of environmentalism in America, focused not only in preserving and protecting a landscape, but restoring and recovering it as well. Alrighty everyone, welcome to the show. Before we get started, and before you click away because this is not an ad, I actually want to throw a content recommendation your way. My friend Maddie Pellman has a podcast called Who Runs This Park, where she is trying to interview every single national park superintendent. If you like learning about national park management and administration, or just national parks in general, which if you watch my videos, then those chances are pretty high, then I would definitely recommend checking out who runs this park. Maddie's conversation with Cuyahoga Valley Superintendent Lisa Pettit is actually live right now. It just came out, and you can listen to it wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow Maddie over on Instagram to stay up to date with future episodes. Links to both are in the description. So let's pick up this story where we left off with the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, because there's kind of like a mythology about it in American environmental history. And like with a lot of mythologized events, the truth has been stretched a bit over the course of time. For one, the reason the river fire became so well publicized in the first place was because of a Time magazine article that covered it. Time had a very wide readership, and so a lot of people came to learn about the river that catches on fire. But as I mentioned earlier, this was not an uncommon occurrence. The Cuyahoga had caught fire many times in the past, up to a dozen times. In fact, in the Time magazine article, they used a picture from a different river fire in 1952, not the 1969 fire, because the 1969 fire was extinguished so quickly that no photos were ever taken of it. Now, you might be saying to yourself, what does it matter if it caught fire once or a dozen times? It's a river that catches on fire. Surely the number of times a river has caught on fire doesn't change the argument that said river should be cleaned up, right? Yes, you're right. But the problem with the way the 1969 fire has been remembered and the way it was covered at the time is that it actually obscures the fact that cleanup efforts were already taking place prior to the 1969 fire. By this time, Cleveland was already in the throes of deindustrialization and was actively losing manufacturing jobs. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and anti-Vietnam War protests were sweeping the nation, all of which contributed to an atmosphere of action around the country and in Cleveland, including for those environmental issues we talked about earlier. In 1968, the year before the fire, Cleveland voters approved a $100 million bond issue to start cleaning up the Cuyahoga River, and had also put in place plans to improve its sewage system. Cleveland Mayor Carl Stokes, the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city, had long been campaigning for cleaning up the river. He used the 1969 fire to put on a pollution tour and advocate for federal environmental legislation. So, as you can see, cleaning up the Cuyahoga was already on the minds of many Clevelanders by the time of the 1969 fire, and in fact had been for quite some time. So the prevailing story that the 1969 fire was this eye-opening development bringing to light the ills of industrial America was not quite true. I think Jonathan Adler in the Washington Post puts this really well. He says, quote, "The reality is that the 1969 Cuyahoga fire was not a symbol of how bad conditions on the nation's rivers could become, but how bad they had once been. The 1969 fire was not the first time an industrial river in the United States had caught on fire, but the last," end quote. And this is also where Cuyahoga Valley enters the story. So we're going to change gears here slightly, but we'll come back to the 1969 river fire and this new environmental movement at the end of the story. I'll wrap everything up and put a nice bow on it then, so just hang tight. See, the Cuyahoga Valley is nestled right in between Cleveland and Akron, two huge industrial cities that had greatly benefited economically from America's Midwestern manufacturing might. The Cuyahoga Valley is a land of waterfalls and wetlands and crazy rock formations and, yes, a beautiful, picturesque river valley. But it was the industrialization of Cleveland and Akron that had degraded the Cuyahoga River in the first place, as companies like Sherwin-Williams, Republic Steel, and Standard Oil all used it to dump their waste. Cuyahoga Valley remained fairly sheltered from these industrial developments at first, but as the two megalopolises grew, they threatened to swallow up Cuyahoga Valley entirely, destroying and degrading a once bucolic, largely rural oasis in the heart of an increasingly developed Northeast Ohio. Here again, Clevelanders and Akronites recognized the need to take action. This is the main theme of this episode: active recovery, active restoration. As early as the 1910s, conservation efforts were already underway in the Cuyahoga Valley. In 1917, the Cleveland Metropolitan Park District is established. Akron follows suit with its own park district in 1921. These are the precursors to today's metro parks. These two organizations look to establish a network of regional parklands for their respective jurisdictions, and together protected thousands of acres of land in the Cuyahoga Valley in the middle of the 20th century. Visitors to today's Tinkers Creek Gorge or the Brecksville Reservation or Furnace Creek have these two organizations to thank for the protection of these vital Cuyahoga Valley landscapes. But still, the threats of development and industrialization loomed. Cleveland and Akron continued to grow ever larger, continued to thread their industrial tendrils into the heart of the so-called green-shrouded miracle of the Cuyahoga Valley. By the early 1970s, the size and scale of such developmental creep strained the resources of the mighty but financially constrained Metro Parks systems. Any hope of protecting this place now lie in a whole valley preservation effort. No more piecemeal park building. The problem, though, with a whole valley preservation effort was that it was costly and time sensitive. The metro parks didn't have the funds for parkland acquisition on this scale, and the state of Ohio would need decades to muster the necessary funding, by which time it would be too late. Enter the National Park Service. Around this time, they were spearheading an initiative known as the Parks to the People campaign, which aimed to bring parks to where the people were, namely urban areas. This initiative got off the ground in New York City and San Francisco with the Gateway and Golden Gate National Recreation Areas, the so-called two gateways. Again, this was all about establishing federally managed recreation areas in major population centers in the hopes of expanding park access to disadvantaged urban communities. Interior Secretary Rogers Morton summed this up very succinctly by saying, quote, "We can no longer accept the premise that parks are where you find them. We must identify and create parks where people need them," end quote. For the local conservationists of Cleveland, Akron, and the Cuyahoga Valley, this was music to their ears. By now, they had determined that with the limited local funding situation and the sensitive timeline, really any whole valley preservation effort would have to involve the federal government. Only they had the resources to carry it out. This newfangled Parks to the People initiative seemed perfect for their needs. So these local conservationists work with Ohio Congressman John F. Sieberling on advocating for a Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. Now, there was a lot of political and bureaucratic wrangling and infighting in order to get this park off the ground. And really, that's just too much and outside the scope of this video to cover here. There's links in the description for further reading if you're interested. But suffice it to say, we did eventually get the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area in 1974, and it was later redesignated to a national park in 2000. This also helps to explain why Cuyahoga Valley today retains more of a local or state park flavor with a sprinkling of national park on top. It really did start off as that citizen-led grassroots conservation campaign before federal funding and backing came in to complete the effort. Now, here's where I want to bring this all back around. Remember that this effort to create a Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area was taking place amidst this new form of post-war environmentalism in America. And remember that this new form of environmentalism was focused on cleaning up the environment, on restoring ecosystems, on reclaiming degraded land. This new form of environmentalism was about action. It was about active participation by everyday, ordinary citizens taking charge to help restore a heavily polluted environment. Given that backdrop, then, it's easy to understand why Cuyahoga Valley is the perfect park to encapsulate this era of environmentalism. It was built on a grassroots campaign of concerned citizens and advocates from one of the most heavily polluted cities in America, who all wanted to see their beloved valley protected from the ravages of America's industrial ills. In fact, in 1968, the Cleveland Orchestra chose to locate a summer concert venue here in part because of the community's quote-unquote spirit of preservation. If that's not a perfect example of post-war environmentalism, I don't know what is. And on top of this, Cuyahoga Valley is probably the poster child for restoration in national parks. By and large, this area retained its rural and bucolic character, avoiding the worst of the industrial pollution that plagued Cleveland and Akron, but there still have been several high-profile restorations undertaken here since it came under the Park Service's protection. Let's go through a few. For one, there's the Creshi dump, 50 acres on a former unregulated, unlined dumping site. It was contaminated with paints and solvents and pesticides and all manner of carcinogens, and it actually qualified as a Superfund site. Multiple rangers and visitors reported illnesses after simply visiting the site. It was closed in 1980, and restoration efforts were begun by the Park Service in 1985. Overall, $50 million was pumped into these cleanup efforts, all of which was obtained from the Park Service's first ever contamination legal case brought against the site's former polluters, so they paid for this restoration. The cleanup efforts here involved removing the top 25 feet of contaminated soil off the site, which totaled 375,000 tons of earth, before restoring the area to a more natural vegetation regime. This restoration was only completed in 2021, 36 years later, and public access is still not allowed to this day, although native vegetation and wildlife have returned. Here's hoping that we'll get to visit it soon. There's also the example of the Beaver Marsh, one of the most popular and picturesque areas of the park. This site was a former auto repair shop that beavers later colonized, flooded, and naturally turned into a wetland. Later volunteer efforts removed larger car parts and other trash to complete the restoration. Today, Beaver Marsh is a critical wetland environment in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, providing habitat for countless rare species of aquatic plants and animals. Or it might surprise you to learn that the Cleveland Cavaliers once played basketball in what is now Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Richfield Coliseum was located on a site just off I-271, but after the Cavaliers moved to downtown Cleveland, the Coliseum was demolished, 80 acres of parking lots were torn up, and 5,000 pounds of seeds were planted to turn the area into a wonderful native plant meadow. You'd never know the Coliseum was there by looking at the site today, a testament to the restoration work undertaken there. That's still not all though. Here are a few more quick snapshots at restoration work in the park. In 1999, the park initiated a small-scale homestead leasing program where organic, locally available food is grown right inside the park's boundaries. That's something you won't find in any other national park. In 2022, the Brandywine Golf Course within the park was acquired from private owners and will be restored to native habitat. Regional sewer projects are being undertaken to ensure overflows aren't a threat to the Cuyahoga River. Several dams have been removed from within the park, restoring a free-flowing river, oxygenating its waters, and creating habitat for fish and aquatic invertebrates. Oil and gas wells are being cleaned up. Bald eagles, beavers, and river otters have all returned to the park. Wetlands are being restored and riverbanks are being stabilized. The list goes on, but you can see what I'm getting at here. Cuyahoga Valley National Park was not a set it and forget it type of park. It required an active, concerted effort to restore and reclaim a degraded ecosystem. In many ways, this was not a landscape ready to receive a national park at all. It had pollution problems, development at its boundaries and within its borders, and it carried the burden of its region's industrial legacy. Today, Cuyahoga Valley is still a park in progress. Cleanup efforts still continue. But what I hope to have convinced you of here is that that's okay. That national parks can protect these wild, unbroken landscapes, yes, but that they can also protect the broken ones, too. Cuyahoga Valley is a testament to the power of recovery and to the people who played a part in that recovery. Cuyahoga Valley is a testament to the spirit of restoration that so galvanized the nation after a river caught on fire just a few short miles away. All right, if you've made it here to the end, thank you so much for watching. I've been wanting to tell this story about Cuyahoga Valley literally since day one of National Park Diaries. It's been that long. But it was one of those stories where I knew I had to travel to see it for myself to tell that story, to see the recovery with my own two eyes. I finally got a chance to do that just a few short weeks ago, and the park was all I could have hoped for and more. It's a really special place, and I can't wait to go back. I'm very curious to know your thoughts on this park. Have you been there? Were you aware of its recovery or its past or its history, anything like that? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, direct support on Patreon is always appreciated. Help me keep making these videos. And you can follow me on Instagram for park pictures and channel updates. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.